A moment later, the leg was unbelievably heavy in my hand. I saw that it was supported 5 inches above the table only by my anguished hands. The surgeon had just detached it from the body. I remained for a moment in a ludicrous and tragic attitude, holding my hideous burden. I thought I was going to faint. Finally, I put it down on a pile of bandages beside the table. I shall never forget that leg, even if I live 100 years. My driver had managed to leave, and I waited for a moment of general inattention to do the same thing. Unfortunately, such a moment did not arrive until very late that night. I had to do a great many other things, almost as troubling as the amputation. It was nearly 1 o'clock in the morning when I finally opened the double doors of the house. As the cold struck me, it seemed more violent than ever. I hesitated, but the thought of returning to those dying men and those streams of blood turned me resolutely back into the night. The sky was clear and light, and the air seemed absolutely still. The shadows of the houses and the trucks were stamped with precise outlines on the hard, gleaming snow. I couldn't see a living soul. I walked through the village looking for my Renault. The whole convoy could have been destroyed before anyone gave the alarm. The door of an isba flew open, and a bundle of blankets with a Mauser slung across it ventured a few faltering steps onto the snow. When the man inside the blankets caught sight of me, he mumbled a few words. "You go in now. It's my turn." "Go where?" "To warm up, unless you feel like taking another round." "But I'm not on guard. I've just been helping the surgeon, and now I'm going to get some sleep." "I see. I thought you were—" He mumbled a name. "Did you say there was somewhere to get warm?" "Yes. You go on in there. They've made it headquarters for the guard. We take shifts every 15 or 20 minutes. Of course, you don't get any sleep that way, but it's better than freezing for 2 hours." "Yes, thank you. I'll go in." I pushed open the heavy door and went inside. A big fire was blazing in the fireplace. 4 soldiers, one of whom was Howells, were roasting potatoes and other vegetables under the ashes. The light from the fire was the only light in the room. Another fellow came in right after me, probably the guard I had been mistaken for. I warmed up the rest of the food in my mess tin, ate without appetite, and stretched out on the floor in front of the fireplace to sleep as best I could. Every 15 or 20 minutes, one of the guards would shake awake some poor fellow flattened by sleep. From time to time, the voice of someone protesting his fate would waken me. It was still dark when the reveille whistle shrilled in my ears. Slowly we stood up on the floor which had served as our bed. We were rather stiff, but it had been a long time since any of us had slept without feeling cold. A young Russian woman was coming toward us from the shadows in the corner of the room. She was carrying a steaming pot which she held out to us, smiling. It was hot milk. For a moment I wondered if the milk might not be poisoned, but Howells, who preferred to die with a full stomach, had already grabbed the pot and helped himself to a generous swig. We passed the milk around among the 4 of us, then Howells laughed and returned it to the Russian woman. Neither of them could understand a word the other said. Howells went up to her and kissed her on both cheeks. She blushed a deep red. We bowed and left. Immediately the cold fell on us like an icy shower. There was roll call and distribution of lukewarm ersatz coffee. As on every other morning, we needed a good half-hour to warm up the engines and get them started. Well before daybreak, the 19th Company Rollbahn was jolting along the glare ice of that damned Soviet highway, the 3rd International. Several times we had to make way for convoys driving to the rear. We stopped for lunch in a squalid hamlet where the column of tanks which preceded us had also stopped, and we learned that we were only 50 miles from Kharkov. We were all jubilant to hear that we were so close to our destination. Our convoy should arrive in 2 or 3 hours. We tried to imagine our quarters in Kharkov. "What do you think it will be like?" Lenson asked. The fellow who'd been with me for this interminable trip, the one without a kneecap, was not one to jump for joy. "I hope we won't be spending too much time there," he said. "It would be just like them to send us onto the Volga. I'd rather start back the other way than keep on going east." "If no one wants to go east, we'll never be through with the Russians," someone said. "That's true," another voice remarked. Some people would do better to shut up instead of always talking about how afraid they are. We were back on the road about half an hour later. The sun had disappeared into a fog which veiled the horizon. The cold seemed less sharp, but damp and penetrating. We drove for about an hour. My eyes were half closed, and I had nearly fallen asleep, staring at an illuminated spot on the dashboard. My head was jolting from side to side with the motion of the truck. I decided I might as well sleep and propped myself against the door. Before closing my eyes, I looked out once more at the snowy countryside. The sky had turned grey and seemed heavier than the earth. 2 tiny black spots were coming toward us over the top of the nearest hill. Probably a couple of patrol planes. I closed my eyes. A few seconds later, my eyes flew open again. The roar of an engine passed right over our heads and was immediately followed by a series of crackling detonations. Then something unimaginable hurled me against the windshield, and I felt as if my chest and eardrums were going to explode. There was an intensity of noise which sounded like the end of the world, and we were engulfed in a shower of ice, stones, boxes, helmets, and mess tins. Our Renault nearly crashed into the car in front of us, which had come to a dead stop. Stupefied and bewildered, I opened the door and jumped down to the ground, looking back toward the source of the noise. The truck behind had almost run into us, and behind it a third truck had rolled over. Its wheels were still turning in the air. Beyond it there was nothing but flames and smoke. "Quick! Get over the bank!" Soldiers were scattering across the snow as far as I could see. "They're shooting at the trucks!" someone shouted. I dug myself into 3 feet of snow behind the bank. "Anti-aircraft defense!" yelled a sergeant who was running, doubled over, along the side of the bank. The soldiers floundering in the snow beside me aimed their guns at the sky. Good Lord! My gun was still in the Renault. I was already running back to the truck when I heard the noise of airplane engines once again. I pushed my head into the snow. A hurricane passed over me, followed by explosions, both nearby and far away. I lifted my snowy face and looked at the 2 bimotors diving down behind distant birch woods. The captain's Volkswagen was bouncing from rut to rut, driving down the length of the convoy in reverse. Soldiers were running in every direction. I got up and ran toward a pillar of black smoke. A truck loaded with explosives had been hit by Soviet planes. The truck had exploded, destroying the vehicles immediately in front of it and behind it. The snow was strewn with smoking debris for a distance of nearly 60 yards. What was left of the trucks was burning, giving off a black, acrid smoke. I saw the Feldwebel emerging from this cloud with another soldier. They were carrying a bloody, blackened body. Instinctively, I and some others ran into the black fog to see what we could do. Through the smoke which stung my eyes, I tried to see if I could recognize any human beings. A silhouette crossed my path, coughing. "Don't stay here. It's too dangerous. The munitions cases are about to blow up." I heard the sound of a racing engine, and then 2 headlights pierced the curtain of smoke. A truck was coming along the bank, and behind it another and 2 others. The convoy was continuing its journey. Despite the flames, I was beginning to freeze. I decided to return to the relatively warm cab of my Renault. As the road was becoming visible once more, through the veil of thinning smoke, I noticed a group of soldiers, wrapped in their long overcoats, lined up in front of an officer. "Come over here, you 2, shouted the lieutenant. We ran over to the line. "You," he said, pointing at me. "Where's your gun?" "Over there, Lieutenant, behind you, in the Renault." My voice was trembling with anxiety. The lieutenant looked furious. He must have thought I'd lost my gun and that I was just telling him a story to cover up. He walked over to me like an enraged sheepdog. "Break ranks," he shouted. "Attention!" I stepped out and had only just snapped to attention when I was rocked by a thunderous slap. Although I had pulled it down as far as I could, my cap rolled onto the snow, exposing my dirty, uncombed hair. I thought the lieutenant was going to shower me with kicks. "Guard duty until further orders," he muttered, shifting his furious grey eyes from me to the sergeant, who saluted. "At ease," he added, staring at me with a petrifying expression. "You scum," he went on. While your comrades in arms are getting themselves killed to protect you, you are incapable of spotting 2 stinking Bolshevik aircraft firing at us. You should have seen them. You must have been asleep. I'm going to get all of you sent to the front in a disciplinary battalion. 3 trucks destroyed, 7 men killed, 2 wounded. They must have been asleep too. There's your result. You are unworthy of the arms you bear. I am going to report your attitude." He walked off without saluting. "To your posts!" the sergeant shouted, trying to maintain the tone of his superior. We all ran off our separate ways. I darted for my cap, but the sergeant caught me by the shoulder. "Back to your post!" "My cap, Sergeant." A soldier who was standing right beside my hat gave it back to me. In a daze, I climbed into my truck, which was just starting up. "Wipe your nose," said my driver. "Yes, it seems as if I'm getting it in the neck for everybody." "Oh, don't worry. Tonight we'll be at Kharkov. Maybe there won't even be anything to guard." After the shock of a moment ago, I was beginning to feel angry. He could have seen those planes himself. After all, he's part of the convoy too. Why don't you go tell him that? I thought of the 2 little black dots I had noticed in my half-sleep. There was some truth in what the lieutenant had said, but we hadn't been prepared for anything like that. In fact, we hadn't yet encountered any of the real dangers of war, and we were all exhausted by the lack of sleep, the cold, this endless journey, and by our revolting condition of almost unbelievable filth. We were too cold to wash during the few minutes of our daytime halts, and in any case it was almost impossible to find water. We had to ask the peasants for it, and as they didn't understand a word we said, we had to proceed without their permission, in front of their stupefied faces and their enormous eyes. All of that took time, and we had time only in the evening after dark, when all we could think of was sleep. But all these excuses wouldn't bring my comrades back to life. I was appalled by the thought that a difference of 3 trucks would have meant hours. I had never been wounded, but I already had an idea of how painful that could be. I glued myself to the window. If any others come back, I certainly won't miss them. My driver looked at me with his habitual mocking expression. "You'd better look in the rearview mirror too. They might come up from behind." He was almost sneering. "You think I'm an idiot? What should we do?" He shrugged his shoulders. His expression didn't change. "Well, you know, there really isn't too much you can do. When I broke my knee, I was thinking about my head. The best thing would be to go in the other direction. That's it, and quit on our comrades at the front." He looked at me, and for a moment stopped smiling. Then his face relaxed again, and he added in the same offhand tone as before, "All they have to do is what I just said, half turn, right face." He imitated the tone of a Feldwebel. "You're not really thinking about what you're saying," I said. "The Bolsheviks would certainly take advantage of anything like that. It's impossible. The war isn't over. You have no right to talk that way." He looked me full in the face. "You're too young. You thought I was serious. No, we've got to go as fast as we can and faster." As if to emphasize his remarks, he stepped on the gas. "I'm too young. You all drive me crazy saying that, as if only fellows your age were any good. Don't I wear the same uniform you do?" I didn't really believe what I was saying with such passion, or even that I was really there among all those soldiers. "If you're not satisfied, get another taxi." He was openly laughing at me. As he plainly wasn't going to take me seriously, I was silent. I was both furious and sad. First they beat me up for lack of vigilance, then they bawl me out. Our line of trucks was continuing its sliding advance across the ice and snow. Night was falling, and with the darkness the cold was increasing. The thought that we were nearly at the end of our journey was in some way encouraging. We would be approaching the outskirts of Kharkov within a half hour. What condition would the town be in? It was the last big city before the front, before the Don, and beyond that the Volga and Stalingrad. Stalingrad was still 400 miles from Kharkov. Secretly, despite my feeling of revulsion toward the Soviet countryside, I felt almost disappointed that we weren't yet at the front. Then came the crushing blow. I remember that we were going down a hill. The trucks ahead of us slowed down and then stopped. What now? I had already opened the door. "Shut that door! It's too cold!" I slammed the door in his face and walked across the icy crust that covered the narrow 3rd International Highway. A sidecar had just come to a stop ahead of me and was still skidding on the ice. A courier from Kharkov was bringing us an order. In the grey light, I could see some officers talking rapidly to each other. They seemed to be trying to make a plan, discussing some serious news. One of them, our captain, was reading a paper. Another moment went by, and then a sergeant ran down the length of the convoy, blowing the whistle for assembly. While everyone was collecting, the sidecar, which had started up again, drove by in front of me. There were 2 soldiers in it, wearing what looked like diving suits. The captain came over to us, followed by his 2 lieutenants and 3 Feldwebels. He didn't lift his eyes from the ground, and his expression was one of despair. A shiver of anxiety ran across our shaggy and exhausted faces. "Achtung! Stillgestanden!" shouted a Feldwebel. We stood at attention. The captain gave us a long look. Then slowly, in his gloved hand, he lifted a paper to the level of his eyes. "Soldiers," he said, "I have some very serious news for you. Serious for you, for all the fighting men of the Axis, for our people, and for everything our faith and sacrifice represents. Wherever this news will be heard this evening, it will be received with emotion and profound grief. Everywhere along our vast front and in the heart of our fatherland, we will find it difficult to contain our emotion." "Stillgestanden," insisted the Feldwebel. "Stalingrad has fallen," the captain continued. "Marshal von Paulus and his 6th Army, driven to the ultimate sacrifice, have been obliged to lay down their arms unconditionally." We felt stunned and profoundly anxious. The captain continued after a moment of silence. Marshal von Paulus, in the next to last message he sent, informed the Führer that he was awarding the cross for bravery with exceptional merit to every one of his soldiers. The Marshal added that the cavalry of these unfortunate combatants had reached a peak, and that after the hell of this battle, which lasted for months, the halo of glory has never been more truly deserved. I have here the last message picked up by shortwave from the ruins of the tractor factory Red October. The High Command requests that I read it to you. It was sent by one of the last fighting soldiers of the 6th Army, Heinrich Stoder. Heinrich states in this message that in the southwest district of Stalingrad he could still hear the sound of fighting. Here is the message. "We are the last 7 survivors in this place. 4 of us are wounded. We have been entrenched in the wreckage of the tractor factory for 4 days. We have not had any food for 4 days. I have just opened the last magazine for my automatic. In 10 minutes the Bolsheviks will overrun us. Tell my father that I have done my duty and that I shall know how to die. Long live Germany, Heil Hitler." Heinrich Stoder was the son of Doctor of Medicine Adolf Stoder of Munich. There was an impressive silence, broken only by a few blasts of wind. I thought of my uncle there, whom I had never met because of the rupture between our 2 families. I had only seen his photograph, and they had told me he was a poet. I felt very keenly that I had lost a friend. A man in the ranks began to whimper. His white temples made him look like an old man. Then he quit his rigid posture and began to walk toward the officers, crying and shouting at the same time. "My 2 sons are dead. It was bound to happen. It's all your fault, you officers. It's fatal. We'll never be able to stand up to the Russian winter." He bowed almost double and burst into tears. "My 2 children have died there. My poor children." "At ease," ordered the Feldwebel. "No, kill me if you like. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters." 2 soldiers stepped forward and took the poor man by the arms, trying to lead him back to his place before anything worse happened. Hadn't he just insulted the officers? Unfortunately, he struggled like someone possessed by demons. "Take him to the infirmary," the captain said. "Give him a sedative." I thought he was going to add something else, but his expression remained fixed. Perhaps he too had lost a relative. At ease. We returned to our trucks in small, silent groups. By now it was full night. The rolling white horizon was tinged with a cold bluish grey. I shivered. "It's getting colder and colder," I said to the fellow walking beside me. "Yes, colder and colder," he answered, staring into the distance. For the first time, I was strongly impressed by the dismal vastness of Russia. I felt quite distinctly that the huge, heavy grey horizon was closing in around us, and shivered more violently than ever. 3/4 of an hour later, we were rolling through the ravaged outskirts of Kharkov. We couldn't see very much by our dim headlights, but everything that appeared in the path of the light was damaged. The next day, after one more night on the floor of the Renault, I was able to look at the chaos, which was all that remained of Kharkov, a city of considerable importance, despite the devastation of war. During the years 1941, 1942, and 1943, it was taken by our army, retaken by the Russians, taken back by the Germans, and then finally retaken by the Russians. At this particular moment, our troops were holding the town for the first time, but the town looked like a jumble of burnt-out wreckage. Acres of total destruction had been used as dumps for piles of wrecked machinery of every kind, which the occupying troops had collected in their efforts to clear the roads. This mass of twisted, torn metal reflected the ferocious violence of the battle. It was all too easy to imagine the fate of the combatants. Now, motionless beneath the shroud of snow, which only partially covered them, these steel cadavers marked a stage of the war, the battles of Kharkov. The Wehrmacht had organized itself in the few sections of the city that were more or less standing. The sanitary service, ingeniously installed in a large building, was a bath of rejuvenation for us. When we were clean, we were taken to a series of cellar rooms, which made up a large basement filled with every conceivable kind of bed. We were advised to try to sleep, and despite the hour, it was the middle of the afternoon, we almost all fell into leaden unconsciousness. We were wakened by a sergeant who led us to the canteen. There I found Hals, Lenzen, and Ollensheim. We talked about everything, particularly about the fall of Stalingrad. Hals maintained that it wasn't possible. "The Sixth Army! My God! They couldn't be beaten by the Soviets!" But since the communiqué said they were surrounded, that they didn't have anything more to fight with, what else could they do? They were forced to surrender. "Well, then we'll have to try and rescue them," someone else said. "It's too late," remarked one of the older men. "It's all over." "Shit! Shit! Shit!" Hals clenched his fists. "I just can't believe it!" If for some the fall of Stalingrad was a staggering blow, for others it provoked a spirit of revenge which rekindled faltering spirits. In our group, given the wide range of ages, opinion was divided. The older men were, generally speaking, defeatist, while the younger ones were determined to liberate their comrades. We were walking back to our dormitory when a fight broke out, for which I was mainly responsible. The fellow with the broken knee, my companion in that damned Renault, had just fallen into step with me. "Well, you must be pleased," he said. "It sounds as if we'll be going back tomorrow." I could see a certain irony on his face, and felt myself turning red with anger. "That's enough from you!" I shouted. "I hope you're satisfied. We're going back, and it's at least partly your fault if my uncle is dead in Stalingrad." He turned pale. "Who told you he's dead?" "If he's not dead, that's even worse," I continued shouting. "You're nothing but a coward. It's you who told me we ought to leave them to their fate." My companion was astonished and looked around for reactions. Then he grabbed my collar. "Shut up!" he ordered, lifting his fist. I kicked him in the shin. He was going to hit me when Hals grabbed his arm. "That's enough," he said calmly. "Stop it, or you'll get yourselves thrown in jail." "So you're another young fellow who wants what's coming to him?" My antagonist was now carried away with rage. "I'm going to give it to all of you, you—" "Drop it," Hals insisted. "Shit." He didn't say anything more. A blow from Hal's fist caught him on the chin. He spun around and fell onto his backside in the snow. By now, Lenzen had come up too. "You bunch of kid shits!" shouted my driver. He tried to get up to return to the attack. Lenzen, short and thick-set, kicked him in the face with his metalled boot before he'd regained his balance. He fell onto his knees with a cry of pain, lifting his hands to his bloody face. "Savage!" somebody shouted. We didn't persist further and rejoined the group, swearing under our breath. The others looked at us blackly, and 2 of them helped my driver to his feet. He was still groaning. "We'll have to look out for that one," Howells warned. "He might very well shoot one of us in the back the next time we're attacked." Reveille the next day was later than usual. We went out for company roll call and were greeted by a whirlwind of snow. With our heads muffled in our upturned collars to escape the stinging ice fragments in the wind, we heard some good news. Feldwebel Laus, whom we hadn't seen in an eternity, was standing in front of us holding a piece of paper with both hands. He too was having trouble with the wind. "Soldiers," he read in the lull between 2 gusts. "The High Command, aware of your condition, grants you a leave of 24 hours. Nevertheless, given the present situation, a counter-order could come at any time. You will therefore present yourselves at your billets every 2 hours. Needless to say, this will not give you time to call on lady friends or visit your families," he added, laughing. "But at least you'll be able to write to them." Laus sent 2 men to fetch the mail, which was then distributed. There were 4 letters and a package for me. We would have liked to look at Kharkov, but the appalling weather kept us indoors. We spent a restful day, preparing for the return journey. We were therefore astonished to be told the next day that we would resupply with food and weapons a unit stationed in the combat zone. We were even given, more or less, the precise location of our new destination. We were to proceed to a sector somewhere to the south of Voronezh. We received this news without enthusiasm. "Bah!" said Hals. "Whether we tramp through the snow to Kiev or to Voronezh, it's all the same thing." "Yes," said Olensheim somewhat cautiously, "but Voronezh is at the front." "I know," said Hals, "but we'll have to see it sometime." As for me, I didn't know what to think. What really happened on a battlefield? I felt torn by curiosity and fear. Winter seemed endless. It snowed every day, almost without a break. At the end of February or beginning of March, I no longer remember which, we were taken by rail to a town used as a major supply centre, some 50 miles from Kharkov. Food, blankets, medicines and other supplies were stored in big sheds, and every cellar and hole in the ground was jammed with munitions. There were also repair shops, some indoors, others in the open air. Soldiers perching on tanks blew on their fingers when they grew too numb to hold a wrench. A system of trenches and strongpoints had been organised on the outskirts of the town. This part of the country suffered from frequent partisan attacks, often by large groups of men. Whenever this happened, every mechanic and warehouseman abandoned his tools and inventories for a machine gun to protect the supplies and himself. "The only advantage we have here," one of the soldiers said to me, "is that we're very well fed. There's an awful lot of work. We have to organise our own defence, we take turns standing guard, and things can get pretty tough with the partisans. They've given us some hard times, even with all of us fighting, and they've already destroyed a lot. Several times the CO has asked for an infantry unit to help him out, but it's only happened once. An SS company came, but 3 days later they were sent on to the 6th Army. We've already had 40 killed, which is a lot for one company." That afternoon we organised an odd-looking convoy using 4-wheeled Russian carts to which runners could be attached, transforming them into sleighs. There were also some real sleighs, a few Idekas, and even 2 or 3 troikas covered with decorations, all requisitioned from Russian civilians. As we started off, I remember wondering where we were taking this convoy, which looked so like Christmas, but whose load of shells and grenades was of such a different character. We set off towards the northwest, to a sector somewhere near Voronezh. We had been given special rations for the cold, new first aid kits, and a 2-day supply of pre-cooked dinners. We took a track more or less blocked with snow, which crossed the line of defences that cut off the steppe. A bulky, hooded soldier, who was the only sentry in sight, waved to us as we slowly went by him. His round shape looked enormously vulnerable as he stood there, puffing on a huge covered pipe with his feet planted in the snow. After an hour or so on the trail, which grew increasingly snowy, we fastened the runners to the wheels. Our leather boots, although remarkably waterproof, were not the ideal footwear for tramping through nearly 2 feet of snow. We tired quickly and hung on to the horses' harnesses or the edges of the sleighs with the desperation of cripples clinging to their canes. I myself twisted my fingers into the long hair of one of those shaggy ponies whose pelts are thick and tufted, like sheep's wool. However, the horse's pace was too quick, forcing us into an exhausting rhythm which made us sweat despite the cold. From time to time, one of the leaders of a column would stop and watch the long convoy going by, catching his breath under the pretext of checking the line of march. When they rejoined the column, it was always at the end of the line. I never saw anyone run back to the front. Hals, who had become a real friend, was holding on to the other side of my horse. Although he was much bigger and stronger than I, he also looked as though he were nearly through. His face was almost hidden between his upturned collar and his cap, which had been pulled down as far as it could go. His red nose, like everyone else's, was producing a plume of white vapour. We hardly spoke. I had learned to be as silent as Germans usually are. But even without words, I knew that Hals was a friend who felt as warmly toward me as I did toward him. We gave each other occasional smiles of encouragement, as if to say, "Hang on, we'll make it." We halted at dusk. Feeling that I had been pushed beyond the limits of my strength, I collapsed onto a cart shaft. My legs ached with stiffness, and I could feel exhaustion pulling down my face. Hals let himself fall onto the snow. Ay, my poor feet. All along the convoy, men were sitting or lying on the snow. "We're not spending the night here, are we?" asked a young soldier who was sitting next to me. We looked at each other uneasily. "I don't give a damn what anyone else does," said Hals, opening his mess tin. "I'm not taking another step." "You say that because you're still sweating. Wait until you're a little colder. Then you'll have to move if you don't want to freeze." "Shit," said Hals without looking up. "This food stinks." I opened my mess tin too. The cooked dinners we had been given early in the afternoon had long since cooled and then frozen in the metal containers. It looked like tripe. All around us, other soldiers were making the same discovery. "God damn it," said Hals, "but there's no point in just throwing it out." "What do you think?" someone asked a Feldwebel, who was looking at the stuff in his own tin. "Those bastards must have given us rotten meat." "Or a week of leftovers. It's unbelievable. There's enough food in that town for a whole division. It's not edible. It stinks. We'll have to get out some cans." "No, you won't," the Feldwebel flared out at us. "We still have a long way to go, and none too much food as it is. Throw away the meat if you don't like it, and eat the cereal." Hals, who was never too particular, crunched something vaguely like a lamb cutlet between his teeth. 2 seconds later, he spat it out on the snow. "Pah, it's rotten. The shits must have cooked a Bolshevik." In spite of our dismal situation, we couldn't help laughing. Faced with the ruins of the meal he had been anticipating with such eagerness, Hals was on the brink of one of his rare fits of rage. Given his giant size, these were always impressive. With a stream of oaths, he gave his mess tin a magisterial kick, which sent it flying across the snow. There was a silence, and then a few laughs. "You've made things a lot better for yourself," said the young soldier standing beside me. Hals spun around but said nothing. Then he slowly went off to pick up his tin. I began to wolf down the mess which had been flavoured by the rotten meat. Hals, who looked crushed, collected his battered tin, whose contents had been scattered across the snow. A few minutes later, cursing a cruel fate, we were both digging into my ration. The non-coms appointed guards, and we were faced with the problem of where to sleep. Already clenched with cold, we wondered where and how to spread out our ground sheets. Some men dug themselves hollows in the snow. Others constructed rough huts using the sacks of dried grass which hung from each side of the horses' collars. Others tried to ensure a supply of warmth by making the horses lie down. We had already spent several nights outdoors, but always under more or less sheltered conditions. The fact of sleeping absolutely in the open in such appalling cold terrified us. Here and there, clusters of men discussed what we might do. Some thought we should keep on walking until we came to a village, or at least to some sort of building, on the grounds that it was better to die of exhaustion than of cold. According to this faction, if we stayed where we were, at least half of us would be dead by morning. "We won't be coming to any village for at least 3 days," the non-coms told us. "We'll have to make out the best we can." "If only we could light a fire," one man exclaimed. His teeth were chattering and his voice was almost a whimper. Appalled by the prospect, we prepared ourselves for the night as best we could. Hals and I reorganized the load on a sleigh so that there was a space between the cases of explosives big enough to hold us both. Despite the obvious danger of such a resting place, we preferred disintegration in a hot flash to death by freezing. Hals had the spirit to crack a few obscene jokes, and they made me laugh in spite of my misery. We managed to doze intermittently, huddled together, haunted by the fear of freezing in our sleep. We spent a fortnight in these bitter conditions, and it proved fatal for many of our group. On the 3rd day, we had 2 cases of pneumonia. On subsequent days, we had frozen limbs and Hergesogena brand, a kind of gangrene from cold, which first attacks the exposed portion of the face and then other parts of the body, even if they are covered. Those affected by this condition had to apply a thick yellow pomade, which made them look both comic and pitiable. 2 soldiers, driven mad by despair, left the convoy one night and lost themselves in the featureless immensity of snow. Another very young soldier called for his mother and cried for hours. We tried alternately comforting and cursing him for disturbing our rest. Toward morning, after he had been quiet for a while, a shot jolted us all awake. We found him a short way off, where he had tried to put an end to his nightmare. But he had bungled his effort and didn't die until the afternoon. My feet, tortured by so much walking and by the cold, caused me agonizing pain at first, but soon became so numb that I felt almost nothing. Later, when a doctor checked us, I saw that 3 of my toes had turned an ashen grey. Their nails remained stuck to the double pair of pestilential socks which I took off for the examination. A painful injection saved my toes from amputation. It still seems astonishing to me that any of us should have survived such an ordeal, especially I, who have never been particularly strong. Now, at last, I was going to experience war at the front, and ordeals far worse than anything I had yet known. We used the huts and bunkers of a temporary Luftwaffe airfield for a rest that was indispensable. Most of the field had been abandoned by the Luftwaffe, which had been forced to withdraw farther to the west. Some fighter planes were still there, in various states of disrepair and covered with ice. But a rump ground staff had moved out most of the equipment on big sleighs pulled by tractors. We were allowed several days to restore ourselves in these more or less comfortable circumstances. However, the moment we began to look better, the authorities plunged us back into the thick of things. For the fighting troops of that sector, our company represented a considerable and unexpected supply of manpower. We were divided into fatigue parties and assigned various jobs. 3/4 of our men were put to work preparing positions for 77s and even for light machine guns. This meant shoveling masses of snow and then attacking the earth, which was as hard as rock, with picks and explosives. Hals, Lenson and I managed to stay together. We were in a group ordered to supply an infantry section about 10 miles away with food and ammunition. We were given 2 sleighs, each pulled by a troika of shaggy steppe ponies. The distance was not great, our equipment was better than we'd had on our last tragic expedition, and thinking that we could easily manage the round trip in a day, we accepted the job as an easy one. There were 8 of us altogether, counting the sergeant. I was on the 2nd sleigh, which was carrying grenades and magazines for Spandaus, machine guns from the Spandau works. Sitting on the back of the sleigh, I had plenty of time to observe the dreary, empty landscape. At rare intervals, small stands of spindly trees thrust up from the immaculate white ground. They seemed to be engaged in an unequal struggle with the overpowering whiteness. It seemed to be gaining on them, slowly but surely. There was nothing else to be seen in this countryside, which must surely be inhabited by wolves, nothing except for the opaque, greyish-yellow sky. We seemed to have reached the far end of the world. After a short time, we were following a depression in the snow, which we took as an indication of a path. As we came to the edge of a thick forest, a soldier jumped up from behind a pile of wood and stood in front of our first sleigh, which came to a dead stop. After a few words with our sergeant, he stepped aside, and we entered the forest. There we saw a spandau in action, manned by 2 soldiers, and further on an ant-like swarm of soldiers and innumerable grey tents. There were many big guns, light tanks of the Alpenberg type, Parks, anti-tank guns, and mortars set up on sleighs. A slaughtered horse had been pulled up into a tree and was gradually being transformed into steaks by soldiers whose coats were spattered with blood. We were besieged by soldiers who asked us for mail and cursed us when we said we didn't have any. An officer checked our orders. The company we were to resupply was farther to the east. He sent an orderly to guide us. We continued through the woods, which concealed some 3,000 or 4,000 men, and then crossed a series of small, partly cleared hills. I can still see them with absolute clarity. The white snow was crossed by 3 telephone lines which had been more or less covered over. "Here we are," said the orderly, who was on horseback. "Beyond this crest you will be under enemy fire, so go as quickly as you can. Follow the telephone line. The company you're looking for is about 1.25 miles from here." He saluted in the prescribed fashion and went off at a trot. We looked at each other. "Well, here I go again," said our sergeant, who was undoubtedly a long-time Rollbarn veteran. He waved us forward, then stopped us. "We're going to try and get there really fast. Don't be afraid to beat the horses. If the Russians see us, they'll open fire, but it usually takes them a while. If things get too hot, we'll leave the sleigh with ammunition, because if that goes, anyone closer than 30 yards will never see his mother again." I thought of the attack on the convoy near Kharkov. "Let's go!" someone shouted, to prove he wasn't afraid. The sergeant jumped onto the first sleigh and waved us forward. We soon reached the top of the hill. The horses, panting from the climb, stopped for a moment before dashing down the other side. "Get going!" shouted the sergeant. "We can't stay here!" "Use the whip!" Hals shouted to the fellow who was driving. Our sleigh was the first to start down. I can still see our 3 plucky ponies jumping through the snow like rabbits, from one depression to the next, churning up a white cloud which undoubtedly was visible a long way off. The 3 of us huddled behind the driver in the centre of the sleigh, perched on dark green boxes which carried a disquieting inscription in white stencilled letters. We were all feeling nervous and had forgotten the cold. I tried to watch the horizon through veils of white dust despite our jolting progress. I thought I could dimly see a group of izbas in front of us. All around us, shell holes of a remarkable symmetry mutilated the immaculate whiteness of the slope. Despite our precipitate speed, I noticed the curious borders of these excavations, which the earth thrown up by the explosions had tinged a light yellow. They looked like enormous stylized flowers, with dark brown centres and yellow petals, which turned very pale, almost white at their outer edges. The holes, which had already been there for long enough to be partly filled by new snow, made a subtle variation in this curiously decorative pattern. We reached the bottom of the slope without incident. There were a few heavily damaged izbas and several large guns almost buried in the snow. We stopped beside an izba whose roof sloped right down to the ground. The wall nearest us was of open lattice, and we could see some engineers working inside. They seemed to be taking the building apart. A few men came out carrying pieces of wood. Then a plump sergeant with a white garment pulled over his coat came up to us. "Unload right here," he said. "The engineers are preparing a shelter. It'll be finished in an hour." A loud explosion made us jump. To our right we saw a yellow flash, and then a geyser of stones and dirt, which spouted almost 30 feet into the air. The sergeant turned calmly toward the noise. "Goddamn dirt," he said. "Harder than a rock." We concluded that these fellows were engineers playing with dynamite. The corpulent non-com looked at our orders. "Ah," he said, tapping a box of cans with a gloved finger. "These aren't for us, but our supplies are already 3 days late, and we're living on our reserves, which we're not supposed to touch." If this goes on, you truck drivers certainly take your own sweet time. That's why fellows up front die of the cold. When you haven't got anything inside, you can't keep going." He slapped his belly. Judging by his waistline, it was hard to imagine that he'd fasted for long. He must have had a private store of food hidden away somewhere, because it was clear that, despite our best efforts, the front lines were extremely short of supplies. "You'll have to get over that way," he pointed down the track. "That section is holding a piece of the Don Bank, and you'll go there on your hands and knees if you know what's good for you." We set off across the snow-covered chaos, following a trail marked by trucks half buried in snow. Beyond an embankment, some big guns and heavy howitzers were hidden by a heap of piled-up snow. Once we had passed them, they simply vanished from sight. Their camouflage was perfect. We came to a big trench in which a group of thin, shivering horses were pawing the hard ground. Some sacks of hay, so dry it was practically dust, had been ripped open and put down for them. The poor animals were sniffing at the hay with their rimy nostrils, but didn't seem too tempted. A few frozen horse cadavers lay on the ground among the animals that were still standing. A handful of soldiers in long coats were watching the horses. We passed through a string of rough dugouts and heard machine gun fire coming from quite nearby. "Machine guns," our driver remarked, smiling strangely. "That means we're here." Trenches, foxholes, and dugouts stretched away as far as we could see in all directions. We were stopped by a patrol. "9th Infantry Regiment." "Company," said the lieutenant. "Is it for us?" "No, mein Leutnant. We're looking for the Guille section." "Ah," said the officer. "You'll have to leave your sleighs here. The section you want is over there on the riverbank and on that little island. You'll have to stick to the trenches and be careful, because you'll be in range of the Russian forward positions, and they wake up from time to time." "Thank you, mein Leutnant." The sergeant's voice was trembling. The lieutenant called over one of the men who was with him. "Show them the way and then come back." The man saluted and joined us. Like everybody else, I had grabbed a box that was too heavy for me and was going to carry it on my back. The sound of machine gun fire began again, only louder. "There it goes again! Is it serious or not?" The gunfire grew louder, stopped, and began again, passionate and violent. "That's us," our guide replied. "But wait a few minutes. You can't tell right away whether they're doing it just for laughs or whether it's the beginning of a push onto the ice." We listened to him without a word. He seemed almost relaxed in this disquieting atmosphere. We were perfect novices. Our few scrapes on the 3rd International seemed like nothing. Compared to what might happen here, the firing kept stopping and starting, sometimes very close. At other moments we could hear guns that were clearly further off. Hals suggested we lay our 2 boxes across our Mausers to make a kind of carrying litter. We had just reorganized ourselves to put this plan into effect when we heard some heavy detonations, which followed each other in rapid succession. "That's the Russians," grinned the veteran, walking just ahead of us. The air shook with the rhythm of the explosions. They seemed to be about 300 or 400 yards ahead of us, to our left. "That's their assault artillery. It might be an attack." Suddenly, about 30 yards to the left, there was a sharp and violent burst of sound, followed by a curious cat-like whine, then a series of similar sounds. We hastily put down our burdens and ducked, looking anxiously in all directions. The air was still for a moment. "Don't panic, boys," said our guide, who had also ducked. "We've got a battery of 107S behind that pile of stuff over there, and we're answering the Russians." The infernal noise began again. Even though our guide had told us what it was, I could feel my stomach contracting. "Put on your helmets," said the sergeant. "If the Russians spot that battery, they'll fire on it." "And let's keep going," our guide added. "There isn't a quiet corner within 60 miles. We're no safer here than anywhere else." We began to move forward, bent double. The air around us shook for the 3rd time, and we could hear gunfire all around us. The German battery was firing non-stop, and ahead the noise of the Spandau was getting closer. We passed 3 soldiers who were unrolling a telephone wire along a footpath that crossed our route. The sound of explosions now seemed to have a regular rhythm. "This might be an attack," said the soldier who had come with us. "I'll leave you here. I've got to get back to my section." "Which way do we go?" asked our sergeant, clearly terrified. "Follow the path as far as the Geschnauz, assault gun, over there on the right. They'll be able to tell you. But eat something first. It's lunchtime." He took a few steps in the other direction, doubled over as before. So, that is how one moves on a battlefield. A few days later, I was used to it and paid no more attention. We opened our mess tins and ate, huddled in the snow. I didn't feel particularly hungry. The explosions, which made my head ring inside my icy helmet, seemed far more interesting than food. Hulls, who was not entirely in control of his feelings, rolled his eyes like a hunted animal and looked at me, shaking his head. Maybe we shouldn't stop to eat, if an officer came along. A deafening salvo, which seemed to be passing right over our heads, interrupted us, and we instinctively hunched our shoulders and shut our eyes. Howells was about to speak again when another explosion, different but no less brutal, shook the earth, followed by a loud whistle and another explosion. This time we felt as if we were being lifted from the ground, shaken by an astonishingly violent displacement of air. Then an avalanche of stones and chunks of ice poured down on us. We made ourselves as small as possible, not daring to move or speak. We had dropped our guns and mess tins. "They'll kill me!" shouted a young fellow who had hurled himself into my lap in the general confusion. "They're going to kill me!" There was another loud boom, followed by a deafening German salvo passing over our heads. "Let's go on! We can't stay here!" yelled our sergeant, shoving his helmet further down onto his head. We picked up our boxes like automatons. The trench was wide enough for 4 men to walk abreast, but we proceeded single file, keeping close to one of the walls. I was with Hulls, directly behind the sergeant, who kept exhorting us to move. "Hurry up! Quick! The Russians have spotted our battery. They can see it, and we're right beside it. This damned trench is heading right into their fire. We've got to get to that communication trench down there." Every other minute we had to throw ourselves into the bottom of the trench. The heavy cases kept slipping from our icy fingers no matter how tightly we tried to hold them. It's still astonishing that they didn't explode in our faces. "Hurry up," said the sergeant, disregarding our troubles. "It's down there." "Tell me," said Hulls. "There's still twice as much as this on the sleighs. Do we have to bring all that too?" "Yes, of course. I don't know. Hurry up, for God's sake." While the Russians were reloading, our battery had fired twice. The next Russian salvo fell about 40 yards behind us, followed by 2 others at an indefinable distance, which nonetheless made us double over a little lower. Suddenly there was a deafening hooting sound, followed by an overwhelming noise that shook the earth and the air. One side of the trench collapsed. It all happened so quickly I had no time to duck. I remember seeing what looked like a disintegrating scarecrow flying through the rubble in a cone of flame and falling in several pieces onto the edge of the trench before rolling to the bottom. We were all thrown to the ground without the strength or courage to get up again. "Quick, up! We've got to get to the other trench!" shouted the sergeant, whose face was contorted by fear. "If a shell lands here, it will be a volcano!" There were 2 more explosions. Our guns were firing steadily. Dragging the cases, we climbed across the debris and the body of the poor wretch who had been blown into the air. I glanced at him quickly as we went by. It was a horrible sight. His helmet had fallen down over his face, and its visor was half buried in his chin or neck. His heavy winter clothes were like a sack holding together something which no longer resembled a human form. He was missing a leg, or perhaps it was doubled under him. Another body was mixed into the rubble a short way off. The Russian shell must have landed right on some poor fellows who had ducked their heads and were waiting for the storm to pass. I can remember very distinctly the first deaths I encountered in the war. The thousands upon thousands which followed are blurred and faceless, a vast, cumulative nightmare which still haunts me, in which atrocious mutilations appear side by side with figures who seem to be peacefully sleeping, or with others whose eyes are opened astonishingly wide, stamped by death with an uncommunicable terror. I thought I had already experienced the limits of horror and endurance, that I was a tough fighting man who would return home in due course to recount my heroic exploits. I have used the words and expressions which my experiences from Minsk to Kharkov to the Don suggested to me, but I should have reserved those words and expressions for what came later, even though they are not strong enough. It is a mistake to use intense words without carefully weighing and measuring them, or they will have already been used when one needs them later. It's a mistake, for instance, to use the word frightful to describe a few broken-up companions mixed into the ground, but it's a mistake which might be forgiven. I should perhaps end my account here, because my powers are inadequate for what I have to tell. Those who haven't lived through the experience may sympathize as they read, as one sympathizes with the hero of a novel or a play, but they certainly will never understand, as one cannot understand the unexplainable. This stammering outpouring may be without interest to the sector of the world to which I now belong. However, I shall try to let my memory speak as clearly as possible. I dedicate the remainder of this account to my friends Marius and Jean-Marie Kaiser, who are in a position to understand me, as they lived through the same general events in the same part of the world. I shall try to reach and translate the deepest level of human aberration, which I never could have imagined, which I never would have thought possible if I hadn't known it firsthand. We reached the communications trench, which had seemed like safety to our sergeant, and literally dived into it as a brutal burst of fire scattered the soil beyond the parapet. The two men in white overalls who were already there jumped up in astonishment. One of them had been standing beside the gun, surveying the scene through field glasses. The other, hunched down at the bottom of the hole, had been fiddling with the knobs of a radio apparatus. "The section?" asked our sergeant, puffing for breath. "We've got some supplies for them." "It's not very far," said the soldier with the field glasses, "but you won't be able to get there right now. You'd only be blown up. Put your explosives down, but not right here, and use the bunker." He smiled. Without waiting for him to repeat the invitation, we slid down into a tomb-like structure of boards and hard earth, which was almost without light. Inside, there were 4 soldiers dressed in white. One of them had somehow managed to go to sleep. The others were writing beside a flickering candle. The bunker wasn't high enough for us to stand, and everyone had to move over so we could get in. But we were, at any rate, something new. "Is it solid?" Hals asked, pointing his tattered finger at the roof of the rat hole. "Well, if something lands a little closer, we may get a few lumps on the head, but we'll get by." "How long have you been up here?" I asked. 3 weeks, answered a fellow with a blonde goatee. "Yes, it's quieted down." "You'd better make the most of it," said one of the soldiers from the "Let's go, children," said our sergeant, who seemed to have regained some confidence. Children. He wasn't far wrong. We seemed like children beside these Don veterans. A few rounds from the big guns had seemed to us like the end of the world. There was a great difference between the proud soldiers we'd been in Poland, marching smartly through the villages with our guns slung, and what we were now. How many times in the past I had thought myself invulnerable, filled with the pride we all felt, admiring our shoulder straps and helmets and magnificent uniforms, and the sound of our footsteps, which I loved, and love still, despite everything. But here, by the banks of the Don, we seemed like nothing, like bundles of rags which each sheltered a small, trembling creature. We were underfed and unbelievably filthy. The immensity of Russia seemed to have absorbed us, and as truck drivers we were not dashing figures, but more like the junior maidservants of the army. We were dying of cold like everybody else, only our plight was never mentioned. We left the shelter timidly, glancing toward the nearby parapet which screened off the war, and picked up our dangerous burdens. Everything seemed to have calmed down. There was no more noise, and the light in the sky had become less brilliant. We took a zigzag line of trenches, which ran parallel to the point we had to reach. Everywhere there were shelters filled with half-frozen soldiers trying to warm themselves beside those miraculous gasoline lamp heaters, and everywhere we were greeted by the same question. Any mail? 3 Messerschmitts passed overhead and were greeted by a loud cheer. The confidence which the infantry placed in the Luftwaffe was absolute, and on innumerable occasions the familiar shapes of the planes with the black crosses restored faltering courage and frustrated a Russian attack. Several times, as we moved forward, we had to press ourselves against the side of the trench so that stretcher-bearers carrying wounded could get through. We were drawing close to the outermost limit of the German lines. The trenches grew progressively narrower and shallower, so that eventually we became a kind of human chain, bent nearly double in order to remain unseen. Several times I sneaked a look over the parapet. Some 60 yards ahead, I could see the tall grass on the riverbank, stiff with frost, and somewhere in that space was the section we were supposed to supply. Now we were advancing half exposed, setting off slides of earth and snow as we jumped from one hole to the next. We clattered down into a huge crater, where an orderly in heavy winter clothes was bandaging 2 fellows who were clenching their teeth to keep themselves from crying out. He told us we had reached our destination. We wasted no time inspecting the situation of this cursed section, but put our cases in the hole we were shown and turned back for another trip. By nightfall, we had completed what we later learned to call the priority supply of this front-line section. Nothing had happened since the bombardment of the afternoon, and the unfortunate soldiers on the Don were preparing themselves for another icy night. Although the temperature had risen a little, it was still very cold. We were waiting for 2 of our men who were collecting the scattering of letters these soldiers had managed to write. Hulls, another soldier, and I were sitting on a mound of frost-hardened earth, hidden from enemy eyes. "I wonder where we'll be sleeping tonight," said Hulls, staring at his boots. "Outdoors, I guess," our companion answered. "I don't see any hotels around here." "Come over this way," called someone else from our group. "You can see the river very well from here." We got up from the ground to look through a heap of frosty branches that camouflaged a Spandau aimed and ready to fire. "Look," Hulls said, "bodies lying on the ice." There were numbers of motionless bodies, victims of the fighting of a few days earlier. The soldiers at the had not been exaggerating. The Russians had not removed their dead. I tried to see further into the distance, to what must be the island we had heard so much about, but this was difficult as it was growing dark. I could recognize only vaguely what looked like snow-covered trees. Our soldiers must be crouched among them, watching in the silence, with every sense alert. Beyond, in the heavy, unbreathable mist falling across this mournful landscape, the far bank was almost invisible. On this bank, the German advance had been halted, and Russian soldiers were watching for us. I had reached the front line, the line I had thought about with such dread and had been so curious to see. For the moment, nothing was happening. The silence was almost complete, broken only by occasional voices. I thought I could see a few thin streams of smoke rising through the mist on the Russian side. Then some other soldiers pushed me aside. "If it interests you so much," said one of the grenadiers standing at the foot of the Spandau, "I'll gladly give you my place. I've had enough of this cold." We didn't know what to say. His place was certainly not very enviable. A lieutenant in a long hooded coat jumped into our hole. Before we had time to salute, he lifted a pair of field glasses and stared into the distance. A few seconds later, we heard the sound of heavy detonations coming from behind us. Almost at once there were explosions on the ice, immediately reproduced by a long repetitive echo, and then a sharp whistling sound which rang through the air very close to us. The entire German front responded immediately. The noise of the guns became indistinguishable from the explosion of their projectiles. We all dropped to the bottom of the hole. We felt lost and stared at each other with anguished, questioning eyes. "They're attacking," someone said. The 2 machine gunners didn't fire right away, but stayed beside the lieutenant, staring at the Don. Some of the explosions were loud and strident. Others sounded heavy, as if they were coming from underground. Finally, the grenadier, who had so generously offered his place, decided to speak to us. "The ice is breaking more easily tonight. It's not so cold. Pretty soon they'll have to swim over." We all hung on his words, as none of us understood what was happening. "We'll send out the lightest one here," he said. "If the ice holds his weight, we'll have to blow it up." "He's the lightest," said Hulls with a constricted laugh, pointing to a cringing, very young soldier. "What will I have to do?" the boy asked, white with anxiety. "Nothing just yet," the gunner said jokingly. The bombardment stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The lieutenant looked out through his glasses for a few more minutes, then climbed over the parapet and vanished. We stayed where we were, without moving or speaking. To break the anxious silence, our sergeant ordered us to open our mess tins and eat dinner while we waited for the fellows with the mail. We swallowed down our tasteless, frozen portions without much appetite. As I chewed, I went over to the Spandau to look down once more at the river. What I saw explained the German bombardment of a few moments ago. Great blocks of ice, some of them 2 feet thick, were standing up at right angles to the surface of the river. These ice blocks, partly broken and crushed, formed steep hills of ice, whose crests oscillated with the rhythm of the current beneath the frozen surface. The German gunners fired on the ice every night to deny access to the incessant Soviet patrols, who nonetheless exposed themselves to great danger on these moving blocks. Now the broken ice was rearing up and crashing into other pieces with a strange, heavy sound. New fissures were opening, and the night was filled with the noises of cracking, breaking ice. I stood for a long time, transfixed by the unreal vision, gradually noticing that hundreds of lights were springing up on the east bank. With my eye glued to the loophole, I stared at these lights, which seemed to be growing stronger. "Hey!" I shouted at the 2 regulars. "Something's happening!" They rushed over to me, pushing me aside so they could see. I stayed where I was, shoving my head between theirs. "Hell, you really scared us," one of them said. "That's nothing. They do it every night. The Popovs like to make us think they're warming up. Not at all a bad idea either. Those lights are a damned nuisance. Look how hard it is to see the river now. Even flares make it hard." I couldn't tear myself away from this disquieting vision. All along the vast horizon, the Russians had lit hundreds of braziers, not to warm themselves, because they must certainly have kept their distance from them, but to dazzle our observers. And in fact, when the eye travelled to the east bank, it remained fixed on those fires. Everything else, by contrast, was plunged into darkness, and this enabled the enemy to effect numerous changes which we could deduce only with difficulty. We were able to see a little with flares, but their radiance, although intense, was reduced at least to half strength by the enemy's arrangement of alternating light and darkness. I would have stood and stared much longer if our sergeant hadn't given the signal for departure. We had no trouble returning to the rear. The night, undisturbed by the noises of war, hid our movements perfectly. Everywhere soldiers were curled up in their holes. Those who were asleep had covered themselves with everything they could find, leaving no fraction of themselves exposed, not a nose or the tip of an ear. One needed to be accustomed to this strange mode of existence to know that beneath these mounds of cloth, subtle human mechanisms were managing to survive and garner their strength. Others were playing cards in the depths of their lairs, or writing letters in the flickering light of a candle or of a lamp heater. These marvellous objects, and I call them marvellous deliberately, were about 2 feet high and would operate on gasoline or kerosene. One simply had to regulate the nozzle and the intake of air. A reflector behind a glass projected the light. A story had it that the army was working on an improved model which would also dispense beer. Those who were neither asleep, on guard, playing cards, or writing letters were absorbing the alcohol, which was freely distributed along with our ammunition. "There's as much vodka, schnapps, and Terek liquor on the front as there are packs," I was told later by a wounded infantryman who was waiting for evacuation on the hospital train. "It's the easiest way to make heroes. Vodka purges the brain and expands the strength. I've been doing nothing but drink for 2 days now. It's the best way to forget that I've got 7 pieces of metal in my gut, if you can believe the doctor." We got back to our 2 sleighs without incident. "Am I dreaming?" Hals said. "Or has it grown warmer? I'm sweating like an ox in these clothes." Maybe I've got a fever, that's all I need." "Then I've got one too," I said. "I'm soaking wet." "That's because you had the balls scared off you today," said the fellow who earlier in the afternoon had shouted, "They'll kill me!" "Listen to who's talking," Hals said. "You're still as green as your clothes, and you think you can judge us." Our sleighs were now carrying 6 wounded as well as ourselves. Although they were less heavily loaded than they had been, they ran less smoothly. The little horses were clearly having a hard time. We could almost see the snow growing softer as we looked at it. The wind was carrying large flakes of melting snow, which soon changed to rain. This milder air, after such terrible cold, seemed to us like the Côte d'Azur. It took us 2 hours to reach our huts in the rear lines, and we needed no urging to fling ourselves onto our rough pallets. However, despite the physical and emotional exhaustion of that wearing day, I wasn't able to sleep immediately. I kept seeing the banks of the Don and hearing the whine of enemy projectiles and the explosions, whose violence I would never have been able to imagine. For me, whose eardrums were shattered by the firing of a Mauser, our Polish exercises now seemed like the most trifling of games. The infantry on the West Bank had to fight as well as survive. That was the difference between them and us. We had been promised that we would be as honoured as the infantry, as combat troops, if we distinguished ourselves on our supply missions. This promise, which had been made to us on behalf of our commander at the Wagenlager near Minsk, was clearly addressed to young recruits like Hals, Lenzen, Olensheim, and me. We had taken it as an honour and were proud of the confidence that had been placed in us. Yet the reports in the Frontline Journal blamed us squarely, almost making us responsible for the German retreat from the Caucasus and back beyond Rostov. For lack of supplies, these troops had been forced to abandon territories won with great sacrifices so that they would not suffer the same fate as the defenders of Stalingrad. In their exhortations to us, our officers often asked us to achieve a certain goal despite adverse conditions, at whatever the cost, to do more than was humanly possible, to face the prospect of the worst, including death. We had thought that we had accomplished more than the bare minimum. In fact, despite our unstinted efforts and all our bitter moments, we had achieved somewhat less than half of what had been expected. Maybe we should have given our lives too. Absolute sacrifice was what the High Command called it. These words made my head spin as I stared with wide eyes into the impenetrable darkness, sinking gradually into sleep as into a large black pit. For 3 or 4 more days, we were involved in occupations of more or less the same kind. The snow was melting everywhere, and the cold was lessening as rapidly as it had increased, which seemed to be the way of Russian seasons. From implacable winter, one was shifted into torrid summer, with no spring in between. The thaw did not improve our military situation, but made it worse. The temperature rose from 5 degrees below zero to 40 degrees above, melting the unimaginable ocean of snow that had accumulated all winter. Enormous pools of water and swampy patches appeared everywhere in the partly melted snow. For the Wehrmacht, which had endured the horrors of 5 winter months, this softening of the temperature fell like a blessing from heaven. With or without orders, we took off our filthy overcoats and began a general clean-up. Men plunged naked into the icy waters of these temporary ponds for the sake of a wash. No gunfire disturbed the tranquil air, which was sometimes even sunny. The war itself, whose indefinable presence we still felt, seemed to have grown less savage. I had made the acquaintance of a sympathetic fellow, a non-com in the engineers, whose section was temporarily billeted in the hut opposite ours. He came from Kehl, right across the Rhine from Strasbourg, and knew France better than his own country. He spoke perfect French. My conversations with him, which were always in French, were like rest periods after the painstaking gibberish I was forced into with my other companions. Hals often joined us to improve his French, in the same way I tried to improve my German. Ernst Neubach, my new friend, seemed to be a born engineer. He had no equal in his ability to knock a few old boards into a shelter as weatherproof as one a fully equipped mason might build. He made a shower from the gas tank of a large tractor, and it functioned miraculously, with a lamp heater continuously warming its 40 gallons of water. The first men to use this shower unfortunately received a tepid downpour of water flavoured with gasoline. Although we rinsed the tank repeatedly, the water remained tainted for a long time. In the evenings, waiting to use the shower, there was always a crowd of shouting, pushing men, which often included our superiors. Priority was awarded to whoever produced the largest number of cigarettes or a portion of the bread ration. Our Feldwebel, Laus, once paid 300 cigarettes. The showers always began after the 5 o'clock meal and continued late into the night in an atmosphere of rowdy horseplay. Those who got through the showers first often found themselves tossed onto their backsides in the liquid mud that flooded the outskirts of the camp. Here we had no curfew or other barracks regulations. Once all the day's work was done, we were free to joke and drink for the whole night if we wanted to. We spent about a week in this way, with quiet, uneventful days. Each fatigue party obliged us to flounder through a sea of increasingly sticky mud. We made 3 trips back to the front. Each time it was unbelievably quiet. On horseback or in carts, we took supplies to our troops, whose laundry was spread out to dry on all the parapets. Across the Don, the Russians appeared to be similarly engaged. We spoke to a bearded soldier and asked him if everything was going well. He laughed. "The war must be over. Hitler and Stalin have made it up. I've never seen it so calm for so long. The Popovs do nothing but drink all day and sing all night. They have terrific nerve, too, walking around in the open air, right under our guns. Work saw 3 of them going to get water from the river, just like that. Didn't you, Work?" He turned to a sly-faced soldier who was washing his feet in a puddle. "Yes," Work said. "We just couldn't shoot them. For once, let's all stick our noses out without getting a bullet between the eyes." A feeling of joy and hope had begun to take hold. Could the war be over? "It really might be," Hulls said. "The fellows on the front are always the last to be told anything like that. If it's true, we'll know in a few days. You'll see, Sager. Maybe we'll all be going home soon. We'll have a terrific celebration. It's almost too good to be true." "Don't count your chickens before they're hatched," said one of the older men from the roll barn. His realism dampened us down a little. As usual, we set off down the track, more accurately canal, of liquid mud which led to our camp. We stopped a moment to talk to Ernst, whose section was trying to restore the track to a usable condition. "If it goes on this way," he said, "we'll have to take to boats. 2 trucks came through here, and the stones we broke our backs shoving into the mud completely disappeared. It must be nice down in the trenches. They're in a mess," Hulls said, "and their morale is really terrible too. I wouldn't be at all surprised if they broke up their guns for kindling. Our fellows and the Popovs are having a real spree down there." "Well, let them make the most of it," Ernst said. "There's something funny going on. That radio truck over there is taking messages non-stop, and messengers all the time too. The last one had to leave his scooter and wade in here to bring the commandant his message." "Maybe it was congratulations for your showers," said Hulls. "That would be fine by me, but I doubt it. When those fellows run around like that, everybody else will too before you know it." "Defeatist!" Hulls shouted as we left. When we got back to the camp, nothing seemed to have changed. We devoured the steaming mess the cook served up and prepared for another lazy evening. But we had hardly started our meal when the Feldwebel appeared. "Get the unit together," he said in a tone which brooked no contradiction. A few minutes later, all of us who were able to stand were lined up outside. Flashes of light, closer and more brilliant than before, turned the groups of men running through pools of water into shadow puppets. It was as if a giant, in a fit of terrible fury, were shaking the universe, reducing each man to a ludicrous fragment which the colossus of war could trample without even noticing. Despite the relative distance of danger, I bent double, ready to plunge into my water-filled hole at a moment's notice. 2 big crawler tractors came toward me, with all their lights out. Their wheels and treads had churned the mud into a kind of liquid sludge. 2 men jumped down and almost disappeared in it. "Give us a hand, guard," one of them called. They were splattered with mud right up to their helmets. The bombardment continued to inflame the earth and sky as we loaded some drums of gasoline onto their machine. "There's always something to fart in your face," one of them said to me. "Good luck," I answered. Further off, the soldiers in my unit were rounding up the nervous, jostling horses, which kept falling in the mud and whinnying frantically. Several times trucks came to collect drums of gasoline, so that by daybreak, when my relief hadn't appeared, I wondered how much there was left for me to guard. The bombardment was almost as strong as ever. I felt exhausted and confused. A group of boys from my company came by, led by a sergeant who waved me over to join them. At that moment precisely, one of the first Soviet long-range shells landed about 100 yards behind us. The explosion shook us, and we all started to run as hard as we could. I didn't ask any questions, but looked in vain for the broad shoulders of Hals. Other projectiles were now falling on the camp, which was lit up everywhere. We had thrown ourselves onto the ground and stood up again, covered with mud. "Don't dive like that," said the sergeant. "You're always late. Keep your eye on me and do what I do." A significant howl filled our ears, and all 12 of us, the sergeant included, plunged into the liquid mess. An enormous explosion sucked all the air from our lungs, and a simultaneous wave of mud washed over us. We stood up again, soaked with filth, and wearing the pinched smiles of civilians who climb unscathed from a bad wreck. 3 or 4 more bursts quite nearby forced us down again. Behind us, something was burning. As soon as we could, we ran to the nearest munitions dump. The sight of this mountain of canvas-covered boxes made our stomachs turn over. If anything hit it, no one within 100 yards would have a chance. "Good God," said the sergeant. "There's nobody here. It's incredible." With no apparent thought of danger, he climbed onto the hill of dynamite and began to check the numbers on the boxes, which indicated their next destination. We stood and watched him, petrified, like condemned prisoners, with our feet apart and our heads empty, waiting for orders. 2 fellows soaked through, like us, came running up. The sergeant began to shout at them from his eminence. They snapped to attention despite the thunder of the guns. "Are you supposed to be on duty here?" "Yes, Herr Sergeant," they answered in unison. "Then where were you?" "The call of nature," one of them said. "You went off to crap like that, both of you at once? Idiots. We've got too much trouble here for fun and games. Your names and units." The sergeant had not climbed down. Silently, I cursed this animal with his niggling discipline, who stood there preparing a report, as if nothing unusual were happening. Fresh explosions, which sounded very close, threw us all onto the ground except the sergeant, who continued to provoke Providence. "They're cleaning up our rear," he said. "They must have let loose their goddamned infantry. Get your fat tails up here and help me." Half paralyzed by fear, we climbed onto the volcano. The flashes of light all around us lit our bodies in a tragic glare. A few moments later, we were running as hard as we could, oblivious of the weight of the cases, in our anxiety to get away. Daylight had now begun to rob the spectacle of some of its brilliance. The flashes of light were scarcely visible, and the horizon was shrouded by a dense cloud of smoke, irregularly punctuated by darker plumes. Toward noon, our artillery began to fire. We were still running from job to job, although we were nearly dropping with exhaustion. I can remember sitting in a huge crater which had been dried out by an explosion, staring at the long barrel of a 155 spitting fire with rhythmic regularity. I had found Hals and Lenson, and we were sitting together with our hands over our ears. Hals was smiling and nodding at each explosion. For 2 days we had practically no sleep. The dance of death continued. We were carrying the growing number of wounded to shelters half filled with water and laying them on hastily improvised stretchers made of branches. The orderlies administered first aid. Soon these rough infirmaries, filled with the groans of the wounded, were overflowing, and we had to put fresh casualties outside on the mud. The surgeons operated on the dying men then and there. I saw horrifying things at these collection points, vaguely human trunks which seemed to be made of blood and mud. On the morning of the 3rd day, the battle intensified. We were all grey with fatigue. The shelling went on until dusk, and then, inside of an hour, stopped. Clouds of smoke were rising all along the battered front. We felt as if we could smell the presence of death, and by this I don't mean the process of decomposition, but the smell that emanates from death when its proportions have reached a certain magnitude. Anyone who has been on a battlefield will know what I mean. 2 of the 8 huts that made up our camp had been reduced to ashes. The ones that remained standing were overflowing with wounded. Laus, who had a good heart when the chips were down, saw that we were foundering and allowed us each an hour or 2 of sleep, as he could. We dropped to the ground wherever we were, as if felled by sleep. When our time was up and we were shaken awake, we felt as though we'd only been asleep for a few minutes. With exhaustion threatening to overwhelm us again, we returned to the nightmare of carrying agonized, mutilated men, or laying out rows of horribly burned bodies, which we had to search for their identity tags. These were then sent to the families of the deceased with the citation, "Fallen like a hero on the field of honor for Germany and for the Führer." Despite the thousands of dead and wounded, the last battle fought by the German army on the Don was celebrated the day after the shooting stopped. The mouths of dying men were pried open so that they could toast this Pyrrhic victory with vodka. On a front approximately 40 miles long, General Zhukov, with the help of the accursed Siberia army, which had just contributed to the German defeat at Stalingrad, had been trying to break the Don line south of Voronezh. Instead, the furious Russian assaults had broken against our solidly held lines. Thousands of Soviet soldiers had paid with their lives for this abortive effort, which had also cost us very dear. 3/4 of my company left that evening. The trucks were jammed with wounded, who were lying almost in piles. I was separated from Hals and Lenson for the moment, a separation I never liked. Friendships counted for a great deal during the war, their value perhaps increased by the generalized hate, consolidating men on the same side in friendships which never would have broken through the barriers of ordinary peacetime life. I found myself alone with a couple of men who may have been more or less interesting, but with whom I never had the chance to talk. As soon as I could, I abandoned them for a truck seat on which I attempted to regain some of my strength. The assembly whistle rang in my ears very early the next morning. I opened my eyes. The truck cab had made an excellent bed, more or less the right size, and I felt at last as though I'd had some sleep. But exhaustion had stiffened my muscles, and despite my sleep, I had a terrible time pulling myself onto my feet. Lining up outside, I saw the same exhausted, dishevelled look on almost every face. Even Laus wasn't feeling particularly energetic. He had slept with his equipment like all the rest of us. He told us that we were going to leave this area for a point farther west. As a preliminary, we should stand by to help the engineers load up or destroy what we weren't taking with us. We filed past a big kettle from which we were served a hot liquid that made no pretence to being coffee, and went to join the engineers. We were sent out with donkeys, under orders to range widely, picking up all the ammunition we could find so that it wouldn't fall into the hands of the enemy. The departure seemed to be general. Long lines of infantry caked with filth were marching away from this sea of mud to the west. At first we thought we were being replaced, but this proved to be untrue. The entire Wehrmacht along the western bank of the Don had been ordered to withdraw. We couldn't grasp the logic of following a heroic 3-day resistance with retreat. Most of us were unaware that the Eastern Front had entirely changed since January. After the fall of Stalingrad, a strong Soviet push had reached the outskirts of Kharkov, recrossed the Donets, and moved on to Rostov, almost cutting the German retreat from the Caucasus. Troops there had been forced to return to the Crimea by way of the Sea of Azov, with heavy losses. Our periodical Ostfront and Panzer Wolfram reported that there had been heavy fighting at Kharkov, Kuban, and even Anapa. We never heard a frank admission of retreat, and as most soldiers had never studied Russian geography, we had very little idea of what was happening. Nevertheless, a glance at any map was enough to inform us that the west bank of the Don was the easternmost German line in Russian territory. Luckily for us, the High Command ordered our retreat before an encirclement from the north and south could cut us off from our bases at Belgorod and Kharkov. The Don was no longer one of our defences. It had been crossed both in the north and in the south. The thought that we might have been trapped, like the defenders of Stalingrad, still makes my blood run cold. For 2 days, the Lancer, infantry, had been pulling out either on foot or loaded in trucks. Soon only a small section of the Panzergruppe was left at the nearly empty camp. The passage of vehicles and men had turned the Luftwaffe field into an extraordinary quagmire. Thousands of trucks, tanks, tractors, and men rolled and tramped for 2 days and 2 nights through terrain running with streams of mud. We were in the middle of this syrup, trying to reorganize the materiel we had to abandon.